Check out our streaming schedule for this week. We stream every single day on this channel, talking about all things sports history. And now with college basketball season really getting in the swing of things, we are doing a lot of college basketball streams, commentating the action as we get one step closer to March Madness. So join me every night as we call the best of college basketball. And now, on with our feature presentation. The Super Bowl 25 halftime show was absolutely terrible, like legitimately awful. Not many people actually saw this show, as unless you were actually inside Tampa Stadium for the silver anniversary of the big game, you did not watch it live. And the only way you watched it was after the game was done and post-game coverage had wrapped up. The reason for that was because of the Gulf War and due to Operation Desert Storm, which had just commenced a couple of days before and even put the Super Bowl in jeopardy. Because of that, the actual halftime show on the field was preempted for the news, with Peter Jennings of ABC providing live reports of what was happening overseas. But make no mistake about it, the actual show that we got was awful. For those who did get to see the show, it was a convoluted mess that exemplified everything wrong with halftime shows at the Super Bowl before Michael Jackson got the show at Super Bowl 27 2 years later and put us out of our misery. Disney played It's a Small World 3 times. New Kids on the Block was there, but they were only there for 90 seconds and they lip-synced their songs. Why they couldn't just do the show themselves, I have no idea. The show was entirely centered around kids, with the show being poorly choreographed, the lyrics themselves making no sense, and with the show just being a way for Disney to fill the field while annoying tons of people and making eardrums bleed. The show even ended up destroying the field at Tampa Stadium, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Long story short, the Super Bowl 25 halftime show was a disaster. However, as bad as that show was, at the very least, that show happened. There was an actual halftime show. The halftime show was supposed to feature kids dancing, and we got kids dancing. The halftime show is supposed to feature a 6-year-old singing Wind Beneath My Wings, and by God, we actually got that. As awful as it sounded, we got that. The halftime show was supposed to feature It's a Small World being played over and over again, and we got that. People showed up, music was played, and things were done. Because the Super Bowl 25 halftime show, as bad as it was nowhere close to the worst halftime show of the 1990 season. Because 1 month prior, during a regular season game between the Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers, there was a halftime show so bad and so awkward that it deserves to be dissected roughly 35 years later. And this isn't a subjective matter or anything like that. You'll see exactly what I mean in just a little bit. Call it insanely poor planning on the part of the Packers for not knowing how the weather worked. But let's just say that even the best laid plans of mice and men go awry. And that's exactly what happened here. Because this is the story behind not just the worst halftime show of the 1990 season, and not just the worst halftime show in the history of the Green Bay Packers, but quite possibly the worst halftime show in NFL history. Before I talk about the show, make sure you hit that like button down below, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single video that we post on the channel. We post every single day about the weird and the wacky history of the NFL, with stories that you probably never heard of before like this one. So if you like that, then this is the place for you. I'd appreciate your support a ton, as every like and subscription helps on the road to 70,000 subscribers. So thanks in advance for your support and your generosity. And with that in mind, let's talk about the halftime show that the Pack would like to have back. Before I talk about the actual halftime show in question, we need some context to understand the game that was actually taking place on the field and what the situation was like there. It's December 22nd, 1990, and we have a nationally televised Saturday afternoon game on our hands between two NFC Central rivals in the Green Bay Packers and the Detroit Lions. To say that this was a big game for the Packers would be putting it lightly, and not just because they wanted to sweep a division rival. You see, this season for the Packers, despite not exactly going according to plan thus far, with the team being 6-8, still has a chance to result in a playoff appearance. Even though the Packers had lost 3 straight games to go from 6-5 and potentially in the field to 6-8 and guaranteed to not finish above 500, the Packers were still in the playoff hunt. thanks to the bottom of the NFC being awful and the playoffs expanding to 6 teams in each conference, making it the largest non-strike playoff field in NFL history, and a format that will continue for another 30 years. The Packers, along with a few other teams, only find themselves 1 game back of the Dallas Cowboys for the number 6 seed. So if they can win their final 2 games, they have a good chance at making the playoffs for the first time since 1982, and for the first time in a non-strike season since 1972. Lose this game, and your season is over. Win this game, though, and do it against a reeling Lions team that has dropped 5 of its last 7 games, and have the 2nd worst defense in the conference, and the 4th worst defense in the league at the time, and you're right in the thick of things. Unfortunately for the Packers, however, they could not get it done, as despite leading going into the 4th quarter and dominating the time of possession, the Packers ended up losing the game to the Lions, with Detroit scoring the final 14 points of the contest in the final period to win it 24-17, all but ending Green Bay's season right then and there. It doesn't help if you're Green Bay when you turn the ball over 4 times, with 3 of them coming in the 4th quarter. And it especially doesn't help when you have no answers for Detroit's running game, which was commanded by some scrub that you probably never heard of named Barry Sanders, as he had 133 rushing yards and a touchdown, along with 49 receiving yards, meaning that he had 182 total yards on 7 yards per carry and a whopping 8 yards per touch. When you have no answers for Barry Sanders, whoever that is, I have no idea, usually you're going to have a pretty tough time winning, especially when your own running game is anemic and musters up just 80 rushing yards on 2.7 yards per carry, with your first-round pick putting up just 21 rushing yards on 12 carries himself. For the fans at Lambeau Field who braved the elements to watch their team play for the final time at home all year, it was a rough loss in what had been a rough season following the high expectations set after the 1989 campaign and following a solid start to the 1990 season. Having said that, as you're watching highlights of this game, or lowlights if you're a Packers fan, you might notice something about how the game looks, because we need to address the elephant in the room. That's right, it was really freaking cold. There are certain games where you can just feel the coldness from your television set, because you can see everyone bundled up, and you can see people's breath. And this was one of them. When the game started, the temperature was a mere 2 degrees. The exact wind chill of this game varies depending on what temperature and wind speeds you use. However, when you combine the 2 degrees with wind speeds of 23 miles per hour, under the old formula, the wind chill was a whopping minus 35 that would hover around the minus 25 to minus 39 mark for the entire game. With the new formula that we use today, it wouldn't have been quite as bad, but it would have still been well in the negatives. This was one of the coldest games in the history of the NFL, making many people remember the Ice Bowl held at the same venue roughly a quarter-century before. But the fact that it was brutally cold should not have come as a surprise to anyone. I mean, you're playing outdoors in Green Bay, a city in the northern part of the country on the water, and you're playing it in late December. There is a reason that the Packers never played at home over the final few weeks of the season back then, even when the season was 1 week shorter and there was no bye. Now, playing at home by Christmas? Recipe for disaster from the elements' perspective. The fact that it was cold and a wind chill well in the negatives was not surprising at all. It's not as though you booked a game in Phoenix thinking that it wasn't going to rain, and then it did. This is as though you booked a game in Alaska in December thinking that you were going to have plenty of sunlight to be able to play the whole thing starting at 6 o'clock. No surprises here that it was cold. The same day last year in 1989, the highest temperature on the day was 0, and the low was minus 20. Keep in mind, that's temperature, not wind chill. Across the history of this day in Green Bay at the time, the average temperature was 18 degrees. And with wind chill, which you're going to get high wind speeds seeing as you're on the water, the average wind chill was in the negatives. You get the point. History tells you that it's going to be really freaking cold. So with that in mind, let me tell you what the Packers did for their halftime show. They hired a marching band. That's right, the Packers, knowing that they were playing this game on a traditionally cold day with negative wind chill in late December, decided that it was going to be a good idea to have a marching band play, as they hired the high school bands from Oconto Falls, Spencer, and Burlington to do a routine. And if you know how the laws of physics work, or have any experience with musical instruments, or have any common sense whatsoever, you can probably see in 5 seconds what the problem with that is. Yeah, the instruments freeze. The instruments shrink. Things get stuck and out of place, and they completely freeze, making it impossible to play. A lot of these brass instruments have metal mouthpieces that you have to play into. And when you stick your mouth on metal in a negative wind chill, you're not gonna have a good time. If you want to know an example of that, just watch A Christmas Story and see what happens when you stick your tongue on a metal pole in the cold. Don't try it at home. And we literally saw this with the Ice Bowl at this very venue, when the referee blew his whistle on the first play and his skin ripped off and he started to bleed. Because that's what happens when you have mouths exposed to metal in beyond sub-zero temperatures. For whatever reason, the Packers did not take the possibility that this game would be cold into account, and decided that having high schoolers play brass instruments with metal mouthpieces in negative wind chill was a solid idea. No one for 1 second stopped to think that this was a bad idea. Team President Bob Harlan was more than okay with this concept for a halftime show, where a bunch of teenagers would be doing this, even though it is literally impossible to play in these conditions. Which is why it's going to come as no surprise that there is no footage of this halftime show, because the halftime show did not happen. When the band arrived, director Lovell Ives, the only one with common sense in this entire story, who was looking out for the well-being of his students, went to Team President Bob Harlan and said, "Yeah, so about this halftime show you had us booked for. This is literally impossible to do. There is no way these kids can play." And at this point, the light bulb went off in Harlan's head and he realized, "Oh crap, you're right. It is kind of cold, isn't it?" Said Harlan, director Lovell Ives said that they couldn't play. And I said, "Don't even try it. The instruments would freeze immediately. We don't know what would happen to their lips. So we just told them to forget it." On one hand, common sense finally prevailed. On one hand, we wouldn't have to see kids getting permanent injuries and damaging their instruments for the sake of a short halftime performance, with the hands of the students losing color, the lips being completely damaged, as we saw with the Ice Bowl with the infamous story of the referee who tried to blow the whistle, and a bunch of people likely having to go to the hospital. On the other hand, why the heck did it even come to this point? Seriously, who thought that this was possibly a good idea? This idea should have been shut down immediately. It's like if I have an idea for a halftime show involving all the lights in the stadium to turn off and for a light show to happen, and I buy all the equipment, plan it out, promote it, and then cancel it the day of the game because I realized they were to look awful and be a bad idea because the game is taking place at 1 o'clock, so the sun won't be down yet. Like, it's good that I recognize this and didn't go through with it, but it's bad that I waited until the very last step to come to this realization. If anyone graduated any science class, or watched A Christmas Story, or was on the staff when the Ice Bowl was played, this idea does not get as far as it does. How it did, I have no idea. So note to any people in charge of booking musical entertainment, do not book halftime shows involving marching bands if there is a 99.99% chance that your event is going to have a negative wind chill, especially with high schoolers. It is not safe to play the show. It is physically impossible with these instruments to play it. Trying to make it work is like trying to invade Russia in the winter. You can try it all you want, have this brilliant plan, but it's not gonna work. The Packers were big losers on the field this day against the Lions during this game we've been watching this whole time. But they were even bigger losers off the field with one of the dumbest halftime shows you'll ever see in your life, seeing as the show never happened for very obvious and very foreseeable reasons. Because on Christmas in 1990, just as the world was asking, do they know it's Christmas? I had to ask Green Bay personnel the same thing. Do they know it's winter in Green Bay?
Be sure to like and subscribe if you have not done so already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And check out my other channels, JG8 for the history of college football, JG7 for the history of baseball, and JG9 News, where we talk about all things happening in the NFL. Join me every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, where we'll play live NFL trivia for cash prizes. And make sure to join me live, as we're on stream just about every single day. And thanks to all our Patreon members and our YouTube members for helping out the channel. See how you become a member and show your support financially in the description down below.